Hamas is a terrorist organization, and that's not David Harris saying it. That's the United States government saying it. This kind of barrage of literally thousands of rockets and missiles without the support of Iran. Hamas, again, is a terror organization. It is a jihadist organization. We stand by Israel's side, and we respect their right, indeed their obligation, to defend themselves. In India, I believe currently the second most populous country in the world, and perhaps one day soon, the most populous country in the world.
Welcome, folks. My guest today is one of the Jewish world's foremost expert on the global trends. As he examined the recent development on the world stage, what lies ahead for the Jewish advocacy. He has led the American Jewish Committee, also known as the AJC, since 1990, and is widely referred to as a leading, battle-tested, frontline advocate in today's American Jewish landscape. New York Times described him as a dean of the American Jewish Organization. He was referred to by the late Israeli President Shimon Peres as the foreign minister of Jewish people. Educated in University of Pennsylvania and London School of Economics, and he has been the visiting artist at the Johns Hopkins University and Oxford. His name is David Harris. He is CEO of Washington, D.C. based American Jewish Committee. It is my honor to have his presence on my program. Mr. Davis, welcome to the Khalsa Today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be with you today.
Mr. Davis, please enlighten the viewers about the main activity of the AJC and what role it plays regarding the most important issues facing the Jewish people in the United States and around the world.
With pleasure. Thank you for this opportunity. Again, as the CEO of American Jewish Committee, it's my pleasure to be with you and this distinguished audience. American Jewish Committee was founded in 1906, 115 years ago, in New York City, where we continue to be headquartered, by a group of American Jews who are concerned about threats to Jews around the world, especially in Eastern Europe and Russia. And they created what has become the first experiment, if you will, in Jewish political advocacy, to see whether Jews living in the United States and blessed with freedom could organize and raise their voices and engage with the US government and US Congress and public opinion to be partners in focusing attention on Jews in danger, and Jews were especially in danger at that time in Eastern Europe. And 115 years later, here we are. I sometimes joke because my children early on assumed that I was there at the founding in 1906. After they learned some mathematics, they realized that was not possible. But I've been with AJC since 1979. I've been the CEO since 1990. Today, we are an organization with 24 offices across the United States, with 12, about to be 13 offices overseas, with a social community network of 2.8 million people who follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and that number is growing. And I would particularly point out for this audience that one of our representations abroad is in New Delhi. And one of the things that I'm most proud of, I'm proud of many things here at AJC, many initiatives as we try and look ahead. But one of them was our decision to engage with India in 1990, 91, 92. By the way, as you will know, when relations between India and Israel were a very far cry from what they are today. But we saw the potential in the relationship. And also, I need to add, we saw a growing Indian American community here in the United States. And there was so much engagement on a personal level, on a social level, on an educational level, on a professional level, that we kind of looked at each other here and said, why is it that we have so many commonalities here, such a natural partnership, And yet that's not reflected between Israel and India at the time, or I might add, between India and the United States, another bilateral relationship which has also evolved very dramatically. So that's a little bit about AJC globally and how we view some of the issues that we want to help advance.
Very good. Thank you. Coming back to straight to the point, the most burning topic at the moment, I request you to briefly inform us about the main combating issue, the deadly Hamas, the rocket attacks against Israel and the Jewish state that has caused the unending conflict between Israel and Palestine. Please give us a little detail on it.
I will. My challenge will be, you asked me to do it briefly, and I would like to do it briefly, but it's not a simple topic, of course, but let me try. The current crisis, and as we speak, I am very deeply affected by the crisis, not just because of my work at AJC, but because, like many Jews, I have very close family in Israel. My wife has sisters in Israel and their families. Our daughter-in-law is Israeli and her parents are there now. So this is not just a news item for us or a kind of intellectual or political issue. This is also for many of us, myself included, a very personal issue because we're in close touch with those families. And from one minute to the next, they're either home or they're fleeing to a bomb shelter, or if there's no nearby bomb shelter, they're under stairs because stairs give a little bit more security than simply a normal room. But I think it's very important for people to recognize that from the beginning, which I'll date as 1947, which, by the way, was also a defining year in the history of India. So in some respects, we have parallel histories here. British rule in India, British rule in what was then called mandatory Palestine, a British decision to leave under under challenge from forces in India, forces in then Palestine, a proposal to partition. Again, that sounds familiar, I think, to an Indian audience. But in the case of India, there was a partition. There was the creation of a state with, as I recall at the time, both West and East Pakistan. I don't want to carry the analogy too far because I'm not expert enough, but with major refugee flows and conflict. But ultimately, if you will, a two-state solution was created. India and Pakistan. Bangladesh, we'll call it a third state. In the case, though, of mandatory Palestine, the two-state solution that was proposed at the UN General Assembly in 1947 was rejected by the Arab side, categorically so. So Israel declared its independence actually today, May 14th, 1948. So it's auspicious that we're speaking to one another today. Today, David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, announced the new state of Israel, the reborn state of Israel. President Harry Truman, 11 minutes later, gave American recognition to that state. But the two-state solution was missing. And one can go through the history from then till now and argue that a number of other two-state solutions have been offered, and ultimately each one has been rejected. Now we have an even more complex situation. Again, when I refer to three states in South Asia, we have in some respects a three-state paradigm. We have Israel, we have a West Bank under the authority of the Palestinian Authority, and we have Gaza, which is under the authority of Hamas. Hamas and the Palestinian Authority are enemies of one another. So we have a very complex chessboard, but to your very immediate point, this conflict now was triggered by Hamas. No one should be under any illusion. Hamas is a terrorist organization. And that's not David Harris saying it. That's the United States government saying it. That's the European Union saying it. And that's a number of other countries as well. Their goal, number one, is the destruction of the state of Israel. They do not recognize the state of Israel. There is not a negotiation over borders with Hamas. The only negotiation for them would be our existence. And we're not prepared to engage in that discussion. And the second goal of Hamas is to take over Palestinian society. They succeeded in Gaza. They have not yet succeeded in the West Bank and Eastern Jerusalem. And I think if you look at the events through that prism, it's also very much about internal Palestinian dynamics, where Hamas is trying to show the Palestinian street, we're the ones who can take on Israel. You should join us. The Palestinian Authority is feckless, it's impotent, it's inefficient. So you have a conflict with Israel, yes. Israelis are responding as any nation would. It's not pretty. No one welcomes conflict, but it's unavoidable. And yet at the same time, there's another leg to the triangle, which is the intra-Palestinian conflict, where Hamas is trying to gain ascendancy over the Palestinian Authority.
Oh, thank you. So who's behind Hamas? What do you think? Any external players or actors or the country, and who's supporting all these activity, the terrorism activity of Hamas?
It's a very important question. I'm glad you asked it. Supporter number one, I'm sorry to say, is Iran. And Iran is very much in the news these days because the Biden administration is seeking to explore whether it might be possible to revitalize the Iran nuclear deal. At the same time, could Hamas function in Gaza? Could it mount this kind of barrage of literally thousands of rockets and missiles without the support of Iran? I'm very doubtful. So when we talk about Iran and we talk about the nuclear program, it's obviously extraordinarily important for the world, for the region. But there are other aspects to Iranian behavior which we hope must also be taken into account. And one of those is its regional destabilization. And Gaza is one illustration. Lebanon and Hezbollah is a second. Syria is a third. Iraq is a fourth. Yemen is a fifth. And I could keep going.
Okay, so technically, like what you mentioned earlier, so do you think actually the Gaza is pretty much controlled by the Hamas in these days?
If I can step back for a moment, in 2005, Israel unilaterally totally withdrew from Gaza. It had entered Gaza in 1967 in a defensive war, a war of self-defense, which is now called the Six-Day War. It entered in 1967, and 38 years later, because there was no peace partner, it was not a negotiated withdrawal, it was a unilateral withdrawal. But what it meant for the local residents was their first opportunity, not just in 38 years, but actually in history, to govern themselves. Because before Israel, there had been Egypt. In Gaza, before Egypt, I can keep going back to Ottoman Turkey, but there had never been a self-government. The problem here is that in a way, Gaza is small, but it could have looked for different models of development. One of those models could have been Singapore, which is also not a mighty country like India or the United States. But rather than choose the model of Singapore, of remarkable economic and social development, I fear they chose the model of Somalia or Syria. And what that meant was permanent conflict. So initially, the conflict for the first 2 years was between, again, the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. because initially the Palestinian Authority took charge. 2 years later, they were violently ousted from Gaza by Hamas. For the last 14 years, Hamas has ruled Gaza. Hamas, again, is a terror organization. It is a jihadist organization. It is a proxy for Iran. By the way, it also gets support from Turkey and President Erdogan. Here we are. So periodic assaults on Israel, intra-Palestinian conflict, and no obvious solution. The best that people can talk about is a ceasefire, a temporary cessation of conflict, but no one I know has any bigger solution to a huge problem which will continue to fester.
Well, thank you. Actually, my next question, actually, do you see some immediate de-escalation of the situation?
I don't know. You know, in a situation like this, to be honest, you know, those who do know don't speak, and those who speak usually don't know. And
also, maybe I can ask.
But let me add one thing, if I may.
Sure.
I think from Israel's point of view, as I understand it, it can only look for some kind of ceasefire once it has established its deterrence. In other words, given the nature and dynamics of the region, where every hesitation is immediately perceived as weakness, as lack of will, as a decline in national resilience, Israel, I think, cannot look for a ceasefire before it convinces Hamas that there is a very, very heavy price to pay for firing literally over 1,000 rockets to date, sending millions of people into shelter. So my guess is that Israel will want to, through its own military capability and its own intelligence operations, want to inflict very heavy damage on Hamas and seek to convince Hamas, no, there is no decline in national will, there is no decline in our national resilience, and there is no decline in our ability to confront you.
Yeah, so I mean, David, like terrorism anywhere is terrorism everywhere. What role do you see the U.S. government can play to reach some peaceful resolution of the situation?
I mean, from our perspective, the single most important role the United States can play today, and by the way, has been playing at least until now, has been to stand by Israel's side, to make absolutely clear that there is no ambiguity between our support for democratic Israel and our opposition to jihadist Hamas. There's no ambiguity. We stand by Israel's side, and we respect their right, indeed their obligation, to defend themselves, to protect their citizens, to restore the deterrence. That, I believe, is the single most important role of the United States today. Will that role change in the weeks to come? Perhaps. But right now, as Israel seeks to respond, by the way, as any nation would, I could pose the question, what if those of us sitting in the United States today were subjected to literally 1,000 or more deadly rockets fired from Canada to Buffalo, to Detroit, to Cleveland, to Seattle, or how about to Mexico, from Mexico, fired at San Diego or El Paso or other cities along the southern border? Or what would happen in India if, and you have an issue of terrorism. You know it, and we also know it because among the targets of terrorism in India have been Jewish targets, together with other targets. So you know what terrorism means. You know what counterterrorism requires. you know what deterrence means. And you also understand, I'm sure, in India, as the Israelis do, that if there were 1,000 rockets suddenly launched from across your border towards your cities and towns, what would the Indian government do? I think I know the answer. And my guess is it would not be very different from what the Israeli government is trying to do today. Am I right?
Yeah, you're right. And also, can the recently deadly violence affect the Israel's new relationship with some other Gulf state and the Arab countries, or can it potentially transform the whole region? And I know actually you played very important role. Your AJC organization played very important role building that diplomatic relationship with the other countries.
Well, thank you for acknowledging that. Yes, AJC has played a role over the last 30 years in really planting seeds. It takes time to grow once you plant seeds. But the trees and the flowers have bloomed. And in the last, year, we witnessed from 2 to 6 Arab countries that now have normalized relations with Israel. That's quite remarkable. And we think there are several other countries that are potentially interested in joining that, I will call it that community of peace. Because at the end of the day, the goal of the exercise is not just to win and not just to be deterrent and strong. The goal of the exercise ultimately is what in Hebrew we use the word shalom, the word peace. The goal is peace. Will this affect those 6 relationships? In the short term, perhaps. It puts the 6 countries in an awkward position politically, diplomatically. But I think longer term, I'm quite sure that those ties are very durable. And I offer just one example. The peace treaty with Egypt was signed in 1979. So that's 42 years ago. And if you look at the history of the region, there have been lots of ups and downs. The peace treaty has held. The peace treaty with Jordan was signed in 1994, 27 years ago. Again, many ups and downs in the region. The treaty has held. So I'm quite confident that these new relationships will also blossom. But we're going through a bumpy period right now.
Okay. Now let me ask you, it has been quite some time now when the bilateral relationship between India and Israel acquired the important mention, and both the countries became very close to each other despite discomfort to some others. What value does the relationship between the two countries hold in today's perspective?
That's a wonderful and frankly very easy question. AJC became involved, as I mentioned, in the early 1990s precisely because we saw the many potential compatibilities between India and Israel. By the way, despite their size differential. I mean, we're talking in India, I believe currently the second most populous country in the world, and perhaps one day soon, the most populous country in the world. And Israel, a small fraction of that size, but we saw the commonalities. And to our enormous satisfaction, we've watched over the last 30 years as a dream has been realized. And what explains it? I think a number of things. First of all, as I learned even as a child, India was one of only a small handful of countries on the planet that had never really experienced anti-Semitism. So there was already a very natural affinity between Jews and India, very warm feelings, and I'd like to think in both directions. But politicians needed to step in also to give it more form and shape. I think secondly, India began to see Israel as a very reliable partner. You know, in our world, there are unstable partners and there are stable partners. Both countries are democracies. They may have very different sizes, But democracy and democratic values are not something to be taken for granted or simply given short shrift, as if they're a footnote to a relationship. They're the fundamental backbone of a relationship. Because when a relationship is built not just on interests, technology, water, agriculture, security, defense, but also has a foundation of values, then I think what you found something golden. A relationship that is not, if you will, episodic or ephemeral. Well, right now we need X country, the other country can offer us X, let's sit down, negotiate a deal. What India and Israel found was that they had a long delayed but very solid foundation of natural friendship, natural partnership, overlapping values, common democratic commitments, a certain shared history, as I described earlier, dating back to 1947 and the legacy of British rule in both countries. And then on top of it, common security and strategic interests, natural links in fields from agriculture to irrigation to public health to climate change. I can keep going down a long list. And of course, the more people discovered each other, the more opportunities emerged. So I'm extraordinarily bullish on the India-Israel relationship. And I believe that it was one of the best investments we at American Jewish Committee ever made in terms of our geopolitical worldview.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you. David, as you can see, you'll see your Israeli flag all the time in most of the interview, not only this interview, many.
Okay. I wasn't going to ask, but it's always there.
I love Israel. Next time you have to take me over there. So we'll go together. Okay. And also, the last question, how would you like to conclude and what message you would like to convey to the listener of the Khalsa Today?
Well, first of all, thank you for this wonderful opportunity to have this very engaging conversation. I want to stress again, perhaps, first of all, that the people of India and the Indian diaspora, including here in the United States, and the people of Israel and the Jewish diaspora, including here in the United States, are natural friends, partners, and allies. And not just today, but I believe tomorrow and the day after. And the more we work together, the more our organizations know each other, the more our leaders come together, I think the more potential we will discover to really have an impact here in the United States, in South Asia, in the Middle East, and around the world. And the second thing I would say is the fraternity of democracies. I mean real democracies. I don't mean people's democracies in the Soviet style or illiberal democracies, but the democracies that Israel and India and the United States represent. Those democracies are extraordinarily precious because in much of the world, the values of democracy are not known, much less practiced. And the closer the democratic world comes together in partnership, bilaterally, trilaterally, regionally, quadrilaterally, globally, the more we will be able to build together a safer, more humane, more just, and more equitable world.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Thank you very much. I know you have a very busy schedule, and I know at least the situation, what you are going through. And also, for your information, I always get the inspiration from the AJC, the kind of work you guys do. And I always, at least so, follow you very closely. And even for my viewers, please, if you want to get the more information, please do visit AJC, and they have a very, very fantastic program. Then you take a look and follow David Harris and the AJC.
That's ajc.org on the website, or AJC Global on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and so forth. ajc.org or AJC Global. We invite you to join us.
We will. We are already, actually, so I invite all my viewers actually to follow you and also your organization. Again, thank you very much. Really appreciate for taking the time out of your busy schedule. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.